On a cold April morning in 1945, nearly 5,000 young American airmen climbed into B-17s and B-24 bombers on the dusty fields of southern Italy. A few hours later, they were flying through the skies, turned black with flak over Linz, Austria, Hitler's adopted hometown, the city he dreamed of remaking into the cultural capital of his empire. For these men in those bombers, it was supposed to be one of the last missions of the war, maybe the last. None of them wanted to die with peace so close, but as they flew towards the sprawling rail yards along the Danube, they entered what one gunner later called a man-made hell. Crippled aircraft stumbling from formation, parachutes blossoming over enemy territory, and below, Austrian civilians running for shelter as the bombs fell. Some of those airmen ended up as POWs, some were marched into the gates of the Mauthausen, others fell into Soviet hands and discovered that being liberated could also mean being beaten and interrogated as suspected spies. Many survived, but many came home with memories they locked away for decades. Our guest today, Mike Croissant, is a retired CIA officer who spent more than 20 years as an analyst and counterterrorism targeting officer, serving everywhere from Washington, D.C. to the postings in the Middle East and South and Central Asia. When retired, he received the CIA's Career Commendation Medal for meritorious service. He holds a bachelor's degree from the University of Illinois and graduate degrees from Indiana University and, of course, Missouri State University. Drawing on his professional background and a deep family connection to the air war, he tells the story in his 2024 book, Bombing Hitler's Hometown, the untold story of the last mass bomber raid of World War II in Europe, published by Citadel Press. I'm Jean Badgelan, and you're listening to Talking History. Mike Croissant, welcome to Talking History.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Well, I found your book fascinating, and so I kind of wanted to start with the big picture. What drew you specifically to the 25th of April 1945 raid on Linz, and why do you describe it as the last mass bomber raid of the war in Europe, rather than, just another one of those late war missions that were flown at that time?
Sure. Well, the war is almost over. The men didn't know exactly when, of course, but everybody who participated knew that the end was near. The noose was tightening around the neck of Nazi Germany. The raid happened on the day that the Soviets completed the encirclement of Berlin. It occurred 5 days before Hitler committed suicide in the bunker and 13 days before the official end of the war. So the raid happens against the backdrop of a catastrophic war that's in its final act. The raid happens because Linz, which is the third largest city in Austria, is the site of a major rail system as well as an industrial area. And photo reconnaissance aircraft determined that there are about 2,000 rail cars full of presumed supplies for continuing the war, extending the war. So it is determined that that cannot stand, and those rail cars need to be destroyed. And by the way, the rail system was the last remaining major communication center for the shrinking Third Reich. They could move supplies both north and south and east and west from this rail system. So it was determined that these rail cars would need to be destroyed and the rail system torn up and the rail lines severed. The Allies had tried 21 times before now to accomplish various parts of that same mission, but to pretty poor effect due to the inaccuracy of bombing at that time. I call it the last mass bomber raid of the war in Europe because that's what it was. And the way I define the last mass bomber raid is this is the last time an entire bomb group is sent after a single target. And what I mean by that, not bomb group, entire strategic air force is sent after a particular target. Now, we had two strategic air forces in Europe. We had the 8th Air Force in England, and you had the 15th Air Force, which was based in southern Italy. The raid on Linz was undertaken by the 15th Air Force, which was about half as large as the 8th Air Force was. And The 8th Air Force was literally running out of targets at this time in the war, and though missions continued on through the end of the war by both air forces, this was the last time an entire strategic air force was dispatched to strike a single target. There would be a couple more raids after this one, but these would be individual bomb groups going after separate targets. So this was the last time in Europe when the sun was almost blotted out from hundreds and hundreds of bombers and fighters passing overhead.
Yeah, because when I read your book, I did a double take with the number of airmen involved. It was, thousands of airmen. Usually, I'd imagine perhaps you'd have maybe hundreds, maybe 1,000, but we're dealing with several orders of magnitude larger numbers of people involved in this operation.
Indeed, it was about, once you account for aircraft that had to turn back for mechanical problems, there was about 500 heavy bombers plus 200 escort fighters. So we're talking north of 6,000 young Americans in the skies that day.
So your connection to this story is very personal. How did you learn about your uncle, Ellsworth Croissant, his service, his death, and, how did that affect how you approached the research for this book?
The book goes back to a family mystery. My uncle Ellsworth was, to me, a hero, but I didn't know much about him. I knew that he had been a bombardier in the war and that he had survived, but that he had perished not long after the war ended. The family mystery was their circumstances of his death. He died in a plane crash just a few days after the war ended in September 1945. He had gotten a chance to go home on a military aircraft, and it crashed, killing all aboard, including him. I'm fairly old, but not old enough to have known him. But I did know that his death had devastated our family for obvious reasons. So I started to look into his life around 2007, 2008. I did an investigation of my own using period records to determine why the aircraft went down. And I learned that it really wasn't the reasons that was described to the family by the Army. They had told them that his plane had crashed because it ran out of fuel circling the airfield in bad weather. That turned out to only be partially true. So I took my findings and I shared them with the family in an attempt to give them some peace of mind, give them some closure, if you will. But that just sparked an interest in me to learn more about what came before that, what my uncle was like, what his military service looked like. And to make a long story short, I got from a family member the letters that he wrote home during the war. I made many trips to the National Archives, able to piece together the combat missions that he went on 21 of them during the war. Didn't suffer so much as a scratch, so his death stateside was just hard to bear.
This is kind of a personal story that you begin doing research for your family, but it sort of develops into this, general interest in this particular raid at the end of the war. And it's one that's pretty well known for our listeners out there. Linz is, extremely important, not only strategic town, but as we'll talk about, a cultural center for the Third Reich. And, this is something I think is extremely interesting about your book, is how you kind of take it there. When I was doing research for this episode, I looked up your uncle on there's a website where they have his picture, they have his record from on there. So this is a fantastic piece of research, and for people who are interested in doing historical research, this is actually a really good way in which you can kind of take a small family story, like a micro history, and sort of project it into something, a lot bigger. And, this leads to my next question, and something which I found extremely interesting about your book. I myself don't specialize in military history. I've read some military history, but not about the Second World War. And, one thing I learned from this book was, about the actual procedures and way of life and, how these bombing raids took place. Maybe we've seen movies and things like that, but one of the striking things about the book is the level of detail in what it felt to fly in these missions. The cold, the fear, as well as the kind of routines before takeoff. So, how did you kind of reconstruct that? You are there experience from both the American and German perspectives?
I wanted to get the details right, and I wanted the reader to feel what I felt when I was talking to these men. I interviewed about 55 men who were on the mission, and the way that they would describe it would often give me goosebumps. I dove in at first, and I read everything I could get my hands on in terms of first person accounts to determine to learn about what the men wore, what each man at his position did, what his responsibilities were, the pre-flight procedures and so forth. And I didn't want to get too down in the weeds, but I wanted it to be enough that the reader could almost feel it. In addition to that, I went for a ride on a B-24, so I could know when a guy told me, well, when we dropped the bombs, I looked over my right shoulder and saw, an empty bomb rack. Well, I wanted to be sure that if I did that, that's what I would see. And it all checked out. I read technical manuals. I really went for it. I wanted to get it right because I think I owed it to them. And also, I have a bit of an adventurous streak. I went to Linz twice. I like to get my hands dirty. So I went to Linz and went into a bomb shelter. I interviewed people who were under the bombs and did some phone interviews as well. A lot of American GIs married Austrian women from Linz because Linz was in the American zone of occupation after the war. So between all of those people on my trips to Linz and walking the ground and walking on a road bridge crossing over the rail system right where my uncle's bombs hit really made it real. And hearing the account of a young girl who at the time I think was 5 years old described the single light bulb hanging from a wire in the basement of their apartment and how it would sway and plaster would fall when the bomb struck. It really made it all vivid. And as I said, I owed it to both the Austrians and the Americans to tell an accurate tale to make the reader feel like they were there. And the feedback I got, 4 men read the manuscript before it was published, and unfortunately, none of them made it to the finish line with me, but they all told me that it was pretty spot on. For someone who wasn't there, it came pretty close to describing what it was like. And to me, that's the highest praise I could have gotten.
It's kind of a tangent here, but do you think your experience in the CIA and helped shape, perhaps gave you a deeper understanding of some of the issues these related to war and conflict than perhaps somebody like myself who hasn't served in a military or doesn't have an intelligence background, as it were? Do you think that your professional background sort of gave you perhaps an advantage over, let's say, a professional, quote unquote, professional historian who didn't have that on the ground experience?
Well, I think it helped. I was an analyst for most of my career, and an analyst at heart is a storyteller. It's a person who, digests a lot of information and uses it to tell a story, to tell a narrative for an American policymaker. And the skills that I learned, the research and the critical thinking and the concise writing definitely came into play. I have a natural curiosity and a natural desire to understand other cultures, and like I said, to get out and get my hands dirty. So all of that came together, and I just had a wonderful time. And in a way, there's almost enough to write a book just about writing this book. But in one case, one quick story, I was in Austria just before COVID, and was shown a photo of one of the bombers that went down that day. There were 15 bombers shot down. And the curator of the museum that I was in told me that, I know where that is. So the translator and I hopped in the car and went out there. And within a matter of minutes of arrival, we were at the crash site, and I could verify it because one of the buildings in the photo was still there. And a lovely Austrian family whose house now sits on the site of the crash invited us in, and they had that same picture of the destroyed bomber in a frame next to their front door. And then one house down, there was the tire from that bomber sitting there gathering moss. So it's not enough for me to study and read in at a desk somewhere. I have to get out and I have to make it real and I have to try to make the reader feel what I feel
Well, it definitely
and
comes
what
off.
they felt especially.
It definitely comes off in the book. So, returning back to sort of to the question of Linz and the war. Linz wasn't just another target. We've kind of foreshadowed this, but it was, Hitler's imagined retirement city. It was a cultural showpiece for the Third Reich. It figured in Albert Speer's plans for the post-war era Germany. How did Hitler's obsession with Linz shape the city's development and eventual fate as a target of bombing? You mentioned at the top about Linz being an important rail hub, critical to the logistics of the German war machine, even at the end of the war. But what about this cultural aspect? What about this, operation, against something that's not just strategically important, but also symbolically important, especially as, the Allies know they've won the war, but they're trying to kind of bring the war to an end in the quickest possible way.
I didn't find any indication in the hundreds of pages of documents that I went through that the Allies understood the Hitler connection to Linz, or that bombing military targets in Linz had anything to do with the Hitler connection. It wasn't a psychological operation or anything like that. It was, according to everything I read, strictly a military target. But your question is a good one. The Hitler's obsession, as you called it, with Linz definitely shaped the way that the city developed and how its fate turned out as a bombing target. Hitler spent about 9 of his first 18 years in Linz. He essentially went through adolescence there. He was exposed to German nationalist ideas for the first time in Linz. Lost both of his parents and one of his brothers during the time in Linz. And when he dropped out of school at age 16, he would spend his days strolling through the city with a sketchbook in which he would draw pictures of what he would do to the city if he were able to, and write poetry and other things. But he hated many aspects of the city, some of the architecture, and he wanted to re-envision it as a cultural capital of Europe. So when he returns to Linz as its conqueror in March 1938, he immediately starts to remake the city. He commissions a team of people to begin redesigning the city, to begin developing plans to build a major museum and an opera house and various other cultural things. And the catch was he didn't have a way to pay for it at that time. So he industrialized the city. The entire eastern zone of the city, right against the Danube River, was turned into a major industrial center, the Hermann Goering Works, which produced initially steel and chemicals and such, but would later, as the war went on, start developing and producing armaments. So all of that taken together made Linz a military target for the Americans.
Okay, so, you've already talked a little bit about, some of the people you interviewed, both those who dropped the bombs and those who were on the receiving end of the bombs. And really in the book, you don't shy away from the moral and human cost of strategic bombing on civilians, on POWs, and on the men who dropped the bombs. So after spending so much time with these stories, often historians are perhaps a little bit wary about making, let's say, a moral judgment. But, where do you come down on the ethics and efficacy of the air campaigns against cities like Linz? Of course, we have other controversial examples late in the war. The Dresden firebombing in particular is often cited as a particularly, might perhaps be regarded as a war crime today, et cetera, et cetera. What's your position on this? How do you feel about it? Do you feel it was a harsh necessity, or perhaps it was overkill for that point of the war, or are we just looking at everything in hindsight and from the comfort of 2025 can make easy moral judgments that people at the time couldn't make, or equally is it the reverse? Are we perhaps infantilizing people by saying, oh, they didn't know any better when perhaps they should have? I'm just curious about how you manage that particular question.
The men were torn up inside. Many of them were, if not most. I want to be clear, I didn't get detailed interviews with all 55 of the men. Some were just a quick phone call. Yes, I was on the mission. I saw this and that. But for the precious few where I really got to spend hours and hours and pick their brains and read what they had written, it was very clear that they were torn up inside about the amount of civilian casualties. Now, I'm of the belief that America just doesn't mass bomb civilian areas. That's not what we did then. It's definitely not what we do now. We made a very good faith effort to minimize civilian casualties. The old city of Linz survived virtually without a scratch. You can go there, you can see the balcony that Hitler stood on when he came and spoke to the city in March 1938. All of the cultural stuff survived. A great portion of the city was destroyed, and that's just by nature of the imperfection of the tools that we had at our disposal at the time. The Norden bomb site, which my uncle used, was a marvel at the time, but it was not perfect. The bombs overshot, the bombs fell short, and too many people were killed. But that's war, and that's what the men told me. Unfortunately, that's war, and that's what I believe. I believe, having been involved in somewhat in the so-called global war on terrorism, I tell you 100% that America it bends over backwards to minimize civilian casualties in every case. And by nature of war and war being ugly, it's just inevitable that sometimes the wrong people are harmed. And that's bad, but that's just the way it goes.
What about your encounters in speaking with people in Austria at the time, and how do they remember it? You mentioned the example of the woman who was 5 years old at the time, and obviously for a 5-year-old that must have been a core memory for her, one of her earliest memories. What did you get from the Austrian end of the campaign? How is it remembered in Austria? An American gentleman coming to Austria to talk about their city getting bombed during the war. It's an interesting position to be in.
It is, and I'll learn, especially next summer when I go to Vienna and Linz to talk to large audiences about this. I'll probably be able to answer the question better then. But given the small number of people I interviewed, the overwhelming attitude was, war is hell, and we were too young to really understand what was happening, but it was terrible, and now we understand it, and it's in the past. The young girl that you described, who was 5 at the time, still has PTSD, and she told me that on Saturdays, I believe it's Saturdays in the morning, they test the air raid sirens for civil defense in Austria, and she says almost every time it triggers a memory from back then. So it's terrible that war has this generational effect on people, but I think we could all agree that the ultimate outcome was, if not worth it, certainly morally good.
Okay, so as a kind of final question, you followed these veterans beyond 1945. They have this particular operation, as well as the wider air war, kind of follows them into their post-war lives. What did you learn about this one mission and the wider war, and the way it shaped families, including your family, and how they understood themselves, how they, placed themselves as historical actors long after the war had ended?
I think one of the things that sets my book apart from others is that I spend about the last half of the book describing how the men on the mission got home, both literally and figuratively. 15 bombers were shot down. Some of those were taken in by the Soviets, some by the Germans, and all had various experiences with that were sometimes funny, sometimes horrific. But whoever went on the mission came back different. It was the amount of anti-aircraft fire that these men faced changed them. And a great many suffered PTSD for many years to come after the war. Most of them went on to have families, and I've since become good friends with several family members. And they described, in general, a father who was loving, who was proud to have served, who was patriotic, but was tight-lipped about the war. they would often get glimpses of what GI life was like, or some maybe humorous episodes, but only a very, very small minority, excuse me, open the curtain and let the children get a more full glimpse of what it was like. This was a generation in general that didn't let it out, didn't really talk about it, and certainly didn't seek praise or glory from what they did. And what they did was save the world. So I came away from writing the book with an even deeper appreciation for that generation. I had known many World War II veterans, but not known many that had talked about combat. So to be let in and entrusted with this story, with this burden, to let them unburden themselves to me, was a great blessing. And I'll close with a story. The one man that I became close with, who almost made it to the finish line with me, Dick Halliday. He had been wounded over Linz and nearly died from hypoxia. He called me. Well, I called him the day I got the book deal, and a few minutes passed, and he called me back. And I was in a pub, having an adult beverage or two with my buddies to celebrate. And he called me back and he said, "Mike, I want to thank you, because now the children will understand what it was like and why we couldn't talk about it." And that, instantly choked me up and instantly made me feel like I had done something good for these men. So if people listening choose to read the book, I greatly appreciate it. And I think I hope you'll come away with a deep admiration for the men of the World War II generation and all that they did for us. Every one of these men volunteered. Not one man that I talked to waited to be drafted. They volunteered, and they were proud that they had served. They wouldn't think of it in these terms, but they did save the world.
Mike, thank you for your time. And the book is Bombing Hitler's Hometown, The Untold Story of the Last Mass Bombing Raid of World War II in Europe, published by Citadel Press and published in 2024. That's all we have time for this month on Talking History, but you can catch this episode, as well as all of our back catalogue, at ksmu.org or wherever you get your podcasts.